Welcome to the Let's Talk Growth podcast, where we focus on the topics that can help companies unlock their growth potential. Now here's your host, Bill Hupp.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Growth. Today, I'm joined once again by Mike Haldane, the founder and president of MarketWise Advising. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Bill. Thanks for asking.
We have another special guest joining us today, and I'm delighted to welcome Chad C. Eckes, the founder and principal of C Squared E. Chad, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Mike. Great to be here.
Why don't we start, Chad, by you telling us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I've been fortunate to have a career in technology and software pretty much since getting out of college. For the last 15 years, I've been able to run my own independent consulting practice called C Squared E, and I help software and SaaS companies with go-to-market strategy, namely B2B software companies, not so much B2C. Before going out on my own, I worked for a software subsidiary of the 3M company. I was in product management and product strategy. And before that, I was an IT consultant for Accenture. So like I said, I've had technology in my career and my background pretty much since getting out of college. And I've taken early technology, like hands-on technology experience and parlayed it into being able to do marketing and go-to-market strategy type work. Also, I'll mention in addition to all of those things, I do a lot of market research for my clients. So a big thing they ask me to do is answer questions that they don't yet have good answers to. They are looking for removal of uncertainty. And what I come in and do is offer both primary and secondary research to my clients so that they can make smarter decisions in terms of which markets to go into, which market segments to target, which customers to go after, how to price, things like that.
Okay, and what types of market research do you perform? And then follow up to that, what are some of your go-to techniques, tools, and practices when it comes to performing market research?
Well, in terms of primary research, I'll do in-depth interviews with customers or other experts in a field. I will do surveys, which typically end up being online, sometimes phone surveys, but generally they're typed out written surveys online. I've occasionally done focus groups. I'll also do research that's primary research, but very focused on the competition. So I might do competitive research. I might again, that could be reaching out to customers of those competitors to get insights into how their experience is going with those solutions. And then I'll perform secondary research too. So looking through existing market reports, analyst reports, things like that, just so that we have that under our belts as well. And then you asked about, I think, techniques or practices as well. Was that right?
Yeah, what kinds of tools, techniques, best practices, what kinds of things do you do in order to conduct really effective market research?
Yeah. Well, let me focus on primary research and particularly doing either in-depth interviews or even surveys. But I would break things down into maybe like 5 key steps. There's the planning and designing phase where you need to figure out what questions are you looking to answer, who do you want to get those answers from, things like that. The second would then be recruiting your subjects or your participants, whether you're soliciting them through email or maybe they're your customers and you already have relationships with them. The third would be collecting the actual data through the research, whether that's interviewing the individuals or collecting survey data. The fourth would be like reviewing and analyzing that data. And then the fifth would be reporting on it. So you need to put it all in a summary or put it all in a report that other people can consume. So I think about things in those 5 steps. Within each step, I have picked up different tools, both publicly available and some of my own that I've kind of made up along the way. But like when planning and designing research, I almost always design or create what's called an issue tree. And what I use there is I define like an overarching main question that we're trying to answer, like me and my client. And then that tree is a bunch of sub questions and even questions under that. So it's really, it looks like a branch is, there's like one main question, maybe 5 sub questions, and under each sub question, there's even more sub questions after that. So it's just a way to sort of put a lot of questions on a single page or maybe 2 pages and have some sort of structure and hierarchy to them. It's a great way to get your thoughts and other people's thoughts together. And then that issue tree tends to lend itself to a very common tool in the trade, which would be an interview guide or a discussion guide. Again, if we're talking about in-depth interviews, you're going to want a guide to coach you or to show you how you want to ask questions and things like that. If you were talking about surveys, that would be just the survey questions, but the issue tree is really the starting point for that. So that's like part of planning and designing. That's that first phase. The second phase, which I said was recruiting, there's not a lot of things that I do differently or uniquely there. I might write emails to solicit people. I might hire a third-party recruitment firm to do recruitment because they have access to individuals that are willing to do market research studies. Those are some of the things that I do, but they're not particularly unique. But then the collecting of data and doing the interviews or doing the surveys, things that I do there that I think a lot of researchers would do, but maybe not necessarily. But I definitely always record my interviews and I get them transcribed so that I can read through them afterwards. I don't like to conduct interviews and try to type notes and capture everything people say. I try to make it more of a conversation and listen, and then go back to the transcription and review it. And then that leads to that fourth phase of reviewing and analyzing the data. So what I have at that point is, a body of, 15, 20, maybe 30 transcripts, hundreds of pages of those interviews. And now I have the capability to read through them, pick out key themes. I tend to use like a spreadsheet or a table to sort of plug in, I heard this in this interview, I heard this in this interview. I keep things organized. And then that leads to that fifth and final phase, which is the report. So I can kind of reference all of the analysis I did in that spreadsheet versus going through all the transcripts. And that helps me pull out key themes and write a good report, whether that's a Word document or a slideshow.
Chad, you and I have talked a little bit about AI, and I know that you've got some thoughts on how that potentially impacts market research in the future. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would love to. Thanks for bringing that up. We can't go a single day or even an hour without seeing some new headline about AI and how it's impacting our lives or affecting the stock market or how it's going to change the world. And so it seems like a very relevant topic, and I'm sure others have talked about it in terms of how AI can or might impact the market research. And in thinking about it just recently, it was pretty interesting because after as I went through these steps that I just talked about, sort of the 5 steps in my research process, I think AI can and should impact them, and market research professionals and my clients should be leveraging AI or start using it or start thinking about using it. So I'll just go back to those 5 steps. So I think about that first step of research, which is planning and designing that research. And I mentioned the issue tree and the interview guide. I think generative AI can help in those areas. They can help brainstorm questions. They can help brainstorm, how to frame an interview guide. It's not necessarily a replacement for my intellect or your intellect, Mike, but it's definitely a way to get started and list out a whole bunch of questions that could potentially be part of an interview or could be on the issue tree. Because right now I would, or any professional would just do all that by hand, and you'll leverage your expertise the needs of that particular research to create that. But I think there's a way to leverage AI for that. I don't know if you agree with that or if you want to chime in on that, but I definitely see Gen AI being able to help with something like that.
Yeah, no, totally agree, Chad. I have not used it for that purpose yet, but I've certainly used it to create a draft of marketing content, for example. So it's the same concept. Ask it a prompt and see what it comes back with for answers. So I think it's a great thought. What do you think about AI in terms of, you mentioned in-depth interviews. How do you think beyond the discussion guide, are there ways that AI could be used to actually facilitate a more effective or a more efficient interview?
Yeah, potentially. So I don't see a near term or maybe even long term world where like an AI chatbot with a voice enabled chatbot conducts an interview, because I think, again, with the interviews I do and you probably do, there's a lot of give and take. There's a lot of nuance to understanding what the person is saying and building on what they're saying. And I don't think a chatbot would necessarily be able to do that. However, I think in the moment there might be a use for like an AI chatbot. Like if you're working, you're talking to somebody and they're giving you answers, and you quickly want to validate something, or you quickly want to drill down into something, but you haven't figured out the exact right question yet. As you're doing the interview, like I said, I often transcribe them. I often record them and transcribe them. But what you can do is you could record them and have AI transcribe it in real time and start like spitting out summaries. And you could use those summaries as a way to both validate with the person who is talking and you're interviewing, like, hey, I just heard you say this. Is that what you meant? But then you could also use AI to prompt for a drill down question. Like perhaps you could, if the AI is real time transcribing and almost real time summarizing the meeting to that point or the conversation to that point, it could potentially recommend additional prompts or additional drill down questions. So I'm sort of going in a few directions here, but as I thought about that question and I was kind of thinking out loud about it, I thought, well, yeah, AI could definitely be transcribing in real time, and it could be summarizing and perhaps even responding back with new prompts for additional questions. That as an interviewer, you're listening a lot and you're trying to think about what to ask next, or you've written it down in your interview guide, but you might miss something or might not have the opportunity to get all your questions in. But the AI assistant could potentially be there to prompt you or refer to something that makes sense. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great idea. I remember way back when I first started doing focus groups, way back in the late 90s, there was always a point in the discussion where maybe it was somebody who was just observing, had a question that maybe as the facilitator you missed. And so they would pass a note, which was essentially, hey, be sure to ask this question, right? So this is really just an automation of that using AI. So I think it's a great thought. And, so now I'm thinking about quantitative, what are your thoughts in terms of how AI could be used quantitatively? And maybe the answer is in development of the questions, or maybe the answer is in analysis of the data from a statistical standpoint. But I don't know, what's your thinking there?
Yeah, I mean, those two definitely make sense. I agree with you there. I think one nuance to quantitative data is a lot of times you conduct a survey and you throw in like one or two open-ended questions, right? Like it's never all quantitative where you're using Likert scales or multiple choice or multi-select. So when you have those open-ended questions, again, that's a great place to just throw that data into a chatbot or an AI engine, a large language model, and ask it to summarize them, right? Pick out the key trends, like, and maybe even like do a count, like count the number of times that this came up in the open-ended questions. So I think that's potentially one good use of AI for those open-ended survey questions, which again, most surveys probably have one or two usually the last one is like, anything else we should have asked, or give us your feedback overall. But I think with the quantitative data, I think I haven't used it, but I know that the Microsoft's, I think they're rebranding it Copilot, but Microsoft's solution for their office tools like Excel are starting to get to the point where you can just throw it a tab of data and ask it to generate summaries or ask it to generate charts, and it will make an attempt to do that. So I definitely see that on the horizon. I haven't used it myself, so I'm sort of guessing that exists just based on press releases and what I hear in the media. But I could see that being something that you could use to summarize your survey data. Again, I will say though, and you will probably agree with me, there's always a need for the human side. You can't just leave it all to the computer. I think that can be a head start, or it might give you one unique view of the data, but I think it still makes sense for people like you and I to really crunch the numbers and look at it and do the finer analysis. I mean, what do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I agree. I think these AI tools are like any other tools. They're there to help make the process more efficient, but they're not going to, these are these are not tools that are going to replace the human effort. There's a critical thought component that needs to be there. And then there's, to your earlier point about the discussion, this is a conversation that is two-way in nature, especially when we're talking about a qualitative study. And so that element of kind of the way that goes needs to be there as well. So I'm excited for what these tools bring, because I think they do make us more efficient, but at the same time, I think the process remains a lot the same, and the people involved, same thing for them. So I am curious though, what your view on some of the pitfalls of AI might look like.
Yeah, I mean, again, first and foremost would be over relying on it, right? Like, just, let's say you have 10 full transcriptions of interviews that AI did. Well, there's bound to be errors in it. I just got to be honest. I mean, I've seen transcriptions of interviews, whether, or meetings that could be, a 10-minute meeting or a 60-minute meeting. And there can be key errors in the transcription that completely change the meaning of what somebody said. So you have to still go through it with somewhat of a fine-tooth comb, and make sure there aren't those big mistakes, because like any AI engine, it needs great data to have great output. So if you're giving it transcripts from 10 interviews that aren't totally accurate, then what comes out may not be totally accurate either. In fact, it gets less accurate. So I think one key pitfall is just not relying on it 100%. Like you just said, it's a great tool to have, to give you a head start, to be an aid, but you still need, to do the work of reviewing those transcripts and pulling out key themes and making sure that, to some degree they were done correctly. I think AI will get better over time, but there's always, again, we're talking on computer microphones today. That's usually how you're doing interviews nowadays, and somebody's audio might not be great, so that transcription might not be great. So the one big pitfall is just relying too much on it and just assuming it's perfect and then moving it forward into the next next step in the process, whether that's the transcription to summary process or the summary to reporting process. So I might get a really great summary that I wrote or that AI helped me write, but it still needs to be polished to put it in front of the client or in front of your boss, right? You don't want to just leave it all up to AI. So I think that's one big pitfall. And another would be just, again, looking out for the hallucinations. Again, this is sort of about the errors that might be in a transcription or in some sort of summary that it outputs. But just beware that this stuff isn't perfect, and it can really get going down the wrong path. I'd be curious if you have any other ideas on that, Mike, because I know you thought about this too.
I think you summarized it well, especially as it relates to qualitative. I was thinking about quantitative, and some of what I think is coming as far as, analyzing the data and running the statistical models and that type of thing. And my thought was, that's great, but when you write your report and you present your report to the client, or to your point, to your boss, if you don't know what's behind the conclusions that were drawn in depth,
Yeah.
you're going to
Yeah.
lose all credibility. So, you really have to be highly involved, from my perspective, in that analysis so that you really understand the raw data and the conclusions and how the recommendations might be.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's a great point. I certainly, I mean, I haven't practiced this as much yet. I mean, I've certainly been leveraging generative AI, chatbots for the last year or so in and around these topics, when I do market research. But again, it's been an efficiency gain, not necessarily helping me with, the full output of the data. So yeah, whether it's quant or qual, I think there's always a need for a human.
Chad, what recommendations would you give to growth leaders on how to adopt AI in their market research practices?
For starters, I would say start small. Again, it would also depend on how much individuals have been using AI already, but I'd pick one area of the process that I laid out and try leveraging AI for that. I think a good starting point would be maybe the first phase where you're developing an issue tree or developing discussion guides. Try leveraging that. Give like a Gen AI chatbot a really nice prompt around what you're studying, who you're targeting with that study, and then ask it to generate, a list of questions. It may even know what an issue tree is, and you can ask it to generate one. But just use that as a way to dip your toe in. Start small. Don't leverage AI in every way that Mike and I have just discussed today. I think that would be too much all at once. And another recommendation, which we've already said, is just, again, don't put 100% faith in it just yet. We all have heard about the hallucinations of AI, and it can only do so much. It's still, improving. We're in the early stages of AI. This is the worst AI we're all going to use in our life. So just, again, don't put wholesale, trust and faith in it. Just, use it for what it's worth. Try to make it make your job more efficient when you're creating content or needing to summarize content. Again, the speech to text engines, I think, are getting better. So leverage those when you can. Those would be a couple of things that come to mind. Mike, do you have any other thoughts on that? Any recommendations?
Not really. I think that's really good advice, Chad. I think use it for what its capabilities are, but don't rely on it too heavily, at least not now.
Well, that'll do it for us on this episode. Chad, it was a pleasure. Thanks for taking some time to come on the Let's Talk Growth podcast.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. This was really great.
Chad, thanks for joining us. It was a great conversation, and really appreciate you taking the time.
Anytime. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Let's Talk Growth. If you enjoyed it, feel free to rate and review the podcast. You can get new episodes and listen to old ones by visiting marketwiseadvising.com/podcasts. Let's Talk Growth is owned, produced, and published by MarketWise Advising, LLC.